The Ukrainian army has conducted a very critical operation. This operation organized by Ukraine was of a nature that would completely change the course of the war. After this operation, the Russian soldiers were completely cornered. The soldiers in the Russian army began to revolt after this defeat. Ukraine thus managed to turn the war in its favor, and the Ukrainian army has moved to organize a much larger operation. In the last days of the Ukraine-Russia war, the Ukrainian army achieved a very serious superiority. After the operations organized by the Ukrainian army, Russian soldiers suffered successive defeats. Deaths. If the Ukrainian army continues in this way, it would completely expel Russian soldiers on its territory very soon. And after that, Putin's invasion dreams would completely fall into the water. An average of 250,000 Russian soldiers lost their lives after Putin declared war on Ukraine. At the same time, Putin lost a large number of tanks and ammunition. Putin was surprised at what to do to fix this situation. After these recent events, the advantages gained by the Ukrainian army were multiplying more and more as the days drew on. Thanks to these successful operations, the Ukrainian army has achieved a very serious psychological superiority over the Russian army. Thanks to this superiority, the Ukrainian army was now conducting much more comfortable operations. Putin has become increasingly combative after successive defeats. The Ukrainian army immediately took action to respond to this. But Putin's unstable and combative attitude has put the Russian military in an even more difficult situation. And after the successful operation of the Ukrainian army, the Russian army became in need of help. After that, Putin immediately contacted other countries and asked for help. Putin has recently started using Russian troops in various ways to invade Ukraine. Putin was planning a lot of operations with missiles, but the Ukrainian army managed to destroy all of them. Immediately after that, the Ukrainian army carried out attacks on Russian headquarters. Thus, the Russian soldiers were completely cornered. The comments of war analysts about these developments were that Ukraine was experiencing its most successful period and Russia had no chance anymore. The biggest mistake of this latest defeat of the Russian army was caused by the failure to take into account the Ukrainian air defense systems. At the same time, the Ukrainian army had made great progress both in the field of intelligence and in terms of modernization of the army. However, the soldiers in the Russian army realized the danger and began to get nervous. But now even Putin had begun to accept the superiority of the Ukrainian army from the bottom of his heart, and the Russian soldiers have now entered into a very difficult process, because the Ukrainian army was conducting numerous operations with HIMARS in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions and was thoroughly cornering the Russian army. The biggest reason for the success of the Ukrainian army in these operations was that it received support from many countries in the field of unmanned aerial vehicles. In the face of both Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles and munitions, the Russian soldiers could no longer resist. The Ukrainian army was detecting the location of the Russian headquarters one by one thanks to the flag officers. Thus, the Russian headquarters began to be destroyed in turn, and the war turned completely in favor of Ukraine. At the same time, the latest information obtained by the Ukrainian intelligence network has given Ukraine a huge advantage. It turned out that the Russian tank platoon was standing in an area almost like a target board. The Ukrainian army immediately mobilized all the means at its disposal and went on the offensive, and the Russian army has suffered its biggest defeat since the war began. Thus, the dominance in the region passed into the hands of Ukraine. But he did not stop the Ukrainian army with this either, and disgraced Putin with the photos he took during the operation. After this move, internal affairs in Russia also began to interfere. The Ukrainian intelligence network has obtained very critical information about Russia in recent days, but he couldn't prove it exactly because he didn't have any evidence. However, after these recent developments, the Ukrainian army has proved everything with photos. This incident attracted intense attention in the world press, and the whole world has seen how difficult the Russian soldiers are in. Putin has suffered huge defeats on the territory of Ukraine that he wants to occupy. That is why the operations organized by the Ukrainian army began to affect Russian soldiers more. Russian soldiers were fleeing the area without taking their ammunition and tanks. Thus, these munitions were confiscated by the Ukrainian army. This situation was of a nature that would change the course of the war, because Russia could not allocate too much money for the army when it was in a big economic crisis. However, the Russian soldiers were getting weaker and weaker as they got stronger. Russia already had very few modern weapons and lost this to the Ukrainian army. After that, the Russian soldiers were surprised what to do. At the same time, the Russian army began to lose one by one the Ukrainian territories it occupied at the beginning of the war, and the images released by Ukraine showed that the Russian military was still using weapons from the Soviet Union, which caused great repercussions around the world, and Putin has disgraced the whole world. The Ukrainian army, which was inadequate in many respects at the beginning of the war, now had enough equipment and ammunition, and now he has reached a very great power in every field. However, Russia, which could not defeat Ukraine even at the beginning of the war, is in a much worse situation now. At the same time, after the strategic operations organized by Ukraine, Putin found himself unable to meet even the basic needs of soldiers in the Russian army. If the Ukrainian army managed to use its advantages correctly, it would be able to completely expel Russian soldiers on its territory. And now it seems that the Ukrainian army will continue to increase its strength every day. After the developments in recent days, the Ukrainian army is expected to make a move to end the war, and the comments made by war analysts have resonated all over the world. According to the comments made by war analysts, it was stated that the Ukrainian army will organize a very large operation to end the war. And war analysts have now also stated that it is very difficult for the Russian army to win this war. Although Putin made a lot of moves to win this war, all this was ending in defeat. The Ukrainian army, which turned these defeats into an advantage, continued to drive out Russian soldiers on its territory without wasting any time. The Russian people, on the other hand, began to revolt due to the economic crisis experienced after these defeats. At the same time, the Russian people thought that this war was being fought in vain. Even the Russian people had started a signature campaign because they were against the continuation of this war, and despite collecting a lot of signatures, Putin imposed a ban on these campaigns. If Putin continues his policies in this way, he would face losing both his power and the war. Due to Putin's recent aggressive behavior and threats, many countries have started imposing very heavy embargoes on Russia. The Russian economy, which is already very bad, has deteriorated even more because of these embargoes. After that, much bigger problems were waiting for Putin now. After the economic crisis in Russia and the increase in unemployment, the Russian people have no strength left to endure, and the Russian people began to rebel. If Putin does not prevent these rebellions and sit down at the peace table with Ukraine as soon as possible, Putin would now be on an irreversible path. As is the case now, Putin's unsuccessful moves would grow like an avalanche. The Russian people saw Putin as responsible for the military and economic problems. That's why Putin was getting a little closer to the end every day. If Putin does not win this war, he will come to the end of both his power and his political career. Aware of this, Putin began to exhibit combative and aggressive attitudes.